The British Empire in India is often remembered through a lens of progress, for railways that crisscrossed the subcontinent and a legal system that shaped its governance. These are the narratives that have been carefully curated and passed down through generations. But this nostalgia, this selective memory, hides a staggering human and economic cost, a dark underbelly that demands to be acknowledged. The romanticized image of the Raj obscures the suffering endured by millions. Hard data, meticulously gathered and often suppressed, reveals a far darker reality, a story of systematic exploitation and devastation. The numbers paint a grim picture that challenges the glorified accounts. Between 1880 and 1920 alone, a period often lauded for British administrative achievements, British policies, driven by economic self-interest and a callous disregard for human life, caused an estimated 100 million excess deaths in India. This staggering figure represents a loss of life on an unimaginable scale. This demographic catastrophe, a direct consequence of imperial policies, has been conveniently airbrushed from popular histories of the Raj, sanitizing the past and perpetuating a false narrative. Over nearly 2 centuries, from the early days of the East India Company to the formal establishment of the Raj, Britain systematically dismantled India's economy, crippling its industries and undermining its self-sufficiency. It wasn't just about trade, it was about plunder, siphoning off an estimated $45 trillion in today's money to fuel its own rise to global dominance, leaving India impoverished in its wake. This was not trade based on mutual benefit, but a brutal system of extraction, a one-way flow of wealth from India to Britain. This transformed India, once a global powerhouse renowned for its manufacturing and trade, into a symbol of poverty, a land of famine and destitution, its people stripped of their dignity and resources. The consequences of this historical exploitation are not confined to the past. They are still visible in today's global inequalities, shaping the economic landscape and perpetuating cycles of poverty. Understanding this often suppressed history is not just an academic exercise. It is essential to any honest conversation about development, justice, and the legacy of colonialism. This video will delve into the unspoken ledger of empire, examining the true cost of the British Raj, challenging the myths and revealing the hard facts that have been deliberately obscured for far too long. The British East India Company's victory at Plassey in 1757 marked a catastrophic turning point for India. Before colonization, India was a global economic leader, accounting for nearly a quarter of world GDP. British rule, far from modernizing India, brought economic destruction and immense suffering. Apologists highlight railways and law, but ignore the famines, repression, and destruction of indigenous industries. Colonialism was not a civilizing mission. It was a project of plunder, maintained by force. The wealth of Britain was built on the poverty of India, shaping the global inequalities we see today. Confronting this history is crucial to understanding our present. The British Raj, a period of immense power and control, presided over a series of man-made famines. These were not natural disasters in the purest sense, but rather tragedies exacerbated, and in some cases directly caused, by colonial policies. These famines reached a staggering scale, impacting millions across the Indian subcontinent. The sheer number of lives lost is a testament to the devastating impact of these policies. Between 1876 and 1902, during the height of British rule, an estimated 30 to 40 million Indians perished in these famines. This represents a significant portion of the population, and the suffering endured is almost unimaginable. What makes this even more tragic is that, even as millions starved, India continued to export grain abroad, primarily to Britain. This highlights the prioritization of British interests over the well-being of the Indian population. The root causes of these famines can be traced back to several factors, including oppressive British tax policies. Furthermore, the extensive railway network, ostensibly built for development, was often used primarily to facilitate the export of food and resources, further depleting local supplies. These railways were used to transport grain away from famine-stricken areas, rather than to bring much-needed relief to the starving population. The combination of these factors turned what might have been manageable droughts into widespread catastrophes, resulting in mass death and unimaginable suffering. Even as late as 1943, during the Second World War, the Bengal famine resulted in the deaths of over 3 million people. This famine was largely driven by British wartime policies, including the requisitioning of grain for the war effort. The situation was further compounded by the callous indifference of figures like Winston Churchill, whose decisions and attitudes contributed to the severity of the crisis. Beyond the famines, direct violence and oppression were also routine features of British rule. The 1857 rebellion, a major uprising against British rule, was brutally crushed with widespread terror and retribution. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 stands as a stark example of this violence. On that day, British troops opened fire on a large gathering of unarmed civilians, resulting in hundreds of deaths and injuries. These acts of violence were not isolated incidents carried out by rogue individuals. Rather, they were part of a broader system in which Indian lives were consistently devalued and considered expendable in the pursuit of British interests. The Raj's rule was maintained through a combination of fear, intimidation, and the overwhelming display of military force. The overarching pattern of colonial rule was one of systematic exploitation. It was a system designed to generate profit and wealth for Britain, often at the direct expense of the Indian population, leading to widespread poverty and suffering. The immense human cost of the British Empire in India was not simply an unfortunate side effect. It was in many ways a direct consequence of deliberate policies and calculated decisions made by the British government. This dark legacy of violence, exploitation, and neglect continues to cast a long shadow, and its echoes can still be felt in India today. British rule in India wasn't just about grand pronouncements and official ceremonies. It was a system deeply rooted in both passive and active violence, a constant assertion of power that permeated every level of society, to maintain control, from the smallest village to the grandest city. The mechanisms of governance were designed to extract resources and suppress dissent. Famines were not simply natural disasters, they were systemic, directly caused by the deliberate dismantling of traditional food systems that had sustained communities for centuries. The British imposed market-driven policies that ruthlessly prioritized profit over the well-being of the Indian people. The needs of the many were sacrificed for the enrichment of a few. When crops failed, often due to policies that encouraged cash crops over sustenance farming, peasants lost their land, their livelihood stripped away by debt and despair. And when faced with widespread starvation, the government, driven by laissez-faire ideology, largely refused to intervene, as millions starved, a stark indictment of colonial priorities. Global conflicts only worsened the suffering. Indian resources and soldiers were relentlessly exploited for British wars, with little regard for the cost to Indian society. And then, the devastating 1918 flu pandemic killed an estimated 18 million Indians, a staggering loss of life. This tragedy unfolded amid widespread colonial neglect of healthcare infrastructure. The final act in this drama was partition in 1947, a rushed, arbitrary division of the subcontinent that triggered the largest mass migration in human history, a cataclysm of displacement and suffering. Up to 15 million people were violently uprooted from their homes, and estimates suggest that up to 2 million died in the ensuing sectarian violence. The British, who claimed to maintain order and stability, largely stood by and watched as chaos unfolded. Their responsibility abdicated in the face of unimaginable human suffering. Partition was the violent culmination of decades of deliberate divide and rule policies, designed to weaken resistance by exacerbating communal tensions. The scars of these policies remain deeply etched in the landscape and the collective memory of the subcontinent. Empire's end was as brutal and devastating as its rule had been. The legacy division, trauma, and unresolved conflict continue to haunt the region. The cost of control was ultimately paid in blood, a debt that continues to shape the present. Before British rule, India was an economic powerhouse, its textiles and shipbuilding, and banking envied worldwide. The British drained this wealth through a system where Indian tax revenues bought Indian goods for export, effectively acquiring them for free. After 1858, the system was refined. India's trade surpluses were diverted to London, never reaching Indian hands. Economist Utsa Patnaik estimates Britain siphoned $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. This wealth funded Britain's industrial revolution, global expansion, and elite lifestyles. Meanwhile, India was starved of capital for its own development. Living standards declined, and per capita income stagnated. The Raj's story is not one of development, but of de-development. Britain's prosperity was built on India's impoverishment. The economic drain left a legacy of poverty that endures. India's economic decline was engineered by British policy. Once a world leader in textiles, India's industries were destroyed by tariffs and a flood of British goods. Skilled artisans were driven into poverty. India's share of global manufacturing fell from 25% to less than 2% by 1900. Britain's share soared as India's collapsed. Per capita income stagnated, and by independence, over 90% of Indians lived in deep poverty. Unlike Japan, which modernized independently, India was trapped in underdevelopment. Railways and legal systems served British interests, not Indian progress. The Raj sacrificed India's potential for imperial gain. The legacy, structural poverty, and lost opportunity. The ledger of British rule in India is overwhelmingly negative. Over 100 million excess deaths and $45 trillion drained. This is the true cost of empire. The myth of a benevolent Raj obscures a brutal reality of exploitation and racism. Britain's rise was financed by India's decline. The global inequalities of today are rooted in this history. Acknowledging this past is not about blame, but about understanding how we got here. For Britain, it means reckoning with uncomfortable truths. For India, it reframes development as historical justice. Only by confronting the realities of empire can we hope to build a more just future. The story of British colonialism in India is a lesson in the abuse of power and a call to set the record straight.